Owens staff, and with me today we have Marie Owens Thomsen, who's our SVP Sustainability as well as Chief Economist. We have Preeti Jain, who's the head of Net Zero Research Program at IATA, and then we have Hermant, Misty, who's the Director of Energy Transition at IATA. So we'll start with some slides to discuss a little bit some of the issues and challenges we see, and then there'll be a Q&A session, and we'll have a little bit of availability after that to answer a bit more questions as well. So without further ado, Marie.
Okay. Hi everybody. Interesting to see that that the room is not full, but yet, yeah, maybe that is an expression of how we view the urgency of these matters differently in different regions. No disrespect. We are obviously fully engaged in this topic of bringing airlines to net zero by 2050. And how to do that, I think it's very important to start with the realization that the world today is still using 80% fossil fuels. Of all the energy that we consume, it's 80% fossil fuels. So then we understand that the problem is not the industry, right? The problem is the energy source, because every industry uses this energy source. And we have to have policies all around the world that allow for the maximization of the production of renewable energy in all its forms for everybody, and in liquid form for the industries that need a liquid fuel. And if we do this, then we will be able to maximize the growth potential of the global economy, and also maximize the contribution that the airline industry can make, not only directly to GDP growth, but also to the rate of acceleration in GDP growth. So that's what it is that we're trying to achieve. And that means that we have a number of urgent priorities. So the first one I've already listed, yeah, that we must absolutely work in a concerted fashion across the globe in favor of this maximization of renewable energy and of renewable fuel production. And we must, of course, also work to eliminate unintended consequences of certain policies that we might be trying out, because we're building new markets after all. So some policies are innovative, and that's great, but if they end up being costly and not delivering the result that we want, then we must be able to adapt and remedy such unintended consequences. And of course, in that vein, policies also need to harmonize and standardize. If our industry is what it is today, it is thanks to the harmonization and the standardization that has taken place ever since the time of the Second World War, and very much also under the auspices of our sister organization, if I can put it that way, ICAO, which is the UN body for civil aviation. And in that vein, we obviously think that it's absolutely imperative that we defend CORSIA, which is the global system for offsetting, and try to fend off everybody's willful or otherwise attempts at fragmenting our industry, which would obviously reduce its growth potential and its ability to contribute to the global economy. Now, how are we going to achieve this, you might say, and you might even have read that we're estimating that this is going to cost a hefty 4.7 trillion on the 2050 horizon. And then I say to you that if we could only redirect part of the subsidies that go straight into the bottom lines of oil companies, then, job done Harry, as we might say in the UK. And the chart here that you probably struggle to read shows that, the 5 largest oil companies in a single quarter make almost as, okay, I'm stretching it a bit, but never mind, they make almost as much money as our industry does in a whole year. So that, I think, really should make it crystal clear to everybody that these companies do not need any direct support of their bottom lines. And I'm not at all saying that we do, but the energy shift does. We are not asking for support for our airlines, we are asking for support for renewable energy production. So what we are doing specifically and concretely to help, we want to make airlines both financially and environmentally sustainable and achieve net zero by 2050. So one of the activities that we have to try to help that is to actually provide solutions. And we have created a new international organization called the Civil Aviation Decarbonization Organization that sort of shortens to CADO, which is CADO in English and cadeau in French, which means gift. And we have gifted this organization with the SAF registry that our Information and Data Division has created. Sorry. So the SAF registry allows for the proper and immutable recording of SAF transactions, of each SAF batch and its environmental benefits, so that we can claim against our obligations in an orderly fashion and not double count. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think we can go to the next. And this is as far as we've gotten already with our SAF registry, which is only a month old. Already got 73 organizations on board. We're already processing batches of SAF as we speak. And we have a good geographical spread, and we have a good spread also between airlines and fuel producers and end customers. I do apologize. We continue to build more things. So the next thing that we are ready soon to spring upon the universe is the SAF Matchmaker, a marketplace where supply and demand can meet and connect, and then they go offline for whatever they do next. And this will also help us make a global, transparent, liquid and mature market in SAF, which is what we need to minimize the cost to airlines and maximize the production and bring our airlines to net zero by 2050. Thank you. Over to, I apologize again.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, Marie. So we just heard very, interesting conversation about the frameworks which we are building to bring transparency, robustness, and efficiency, into the SAF entry into the market. Now let's walk through where we stand in terms of the SAF production globally, and also touching upon in India in later slides. So in our SAF assessment at IATA, we are mapping around 300 projects which are spread around the world. And these are basically renewable fuel projects. When I say renewable fuel projects, SAF is one part of the product slate. These renewable fuel projects are also producing renewable diesel and other gaseous product. And SAF is one part of the project, of the product slate, where the flexibility also happens, which I will discuss later. So from what we discussed in December and now, we are exactly in the same track and same direction when it comes to the announcement of these projects. And looking into 160 projects more closely, which we identified, are going to be online. The interesting part there is to notice around 54% projects are just announcements. So it really, makes us realize that how much is the difference between the announcement as the realization of these projects, because it takes easily 4 to 5 years to build one plant. Directionally, HEFA is going to be again the dominant source, again showing that diversification of technologies is not happening as anticipated, and 81% of the total renewable fuel capacity which will be online by 2030 is going to be HEFA. These projects are spread around 40 countries, and when we see renewable fuel capacity location, we see US, China, Netherlands, and are the one of the top 2 or 3 countries where most of this capacity is located. So how this capacity is translating into the production of SAF? So I'm happy to share that when we look into the production, what we estimated in the summer and where we are, directionally we see that we are going to be on the track. But before we get too happy about it, I think it's good to see this bigger square where we show that jet fuel consumption in 2025, which is going to be 311 million ton. And if you see that yellow dot, SAF is not even 1% of the total jet fuel supply pool, clearly showing the big gap which is there between the announcement of projects which we see and the real production of SAF which is really needed for the industry. To come to a number of 2 million ton, around 2 million ton this year which we are predicting, we looked into 3 key parameters. One, we looked into when the new capacity is going to be online, which we see, some of the capacity will make way in this year, adding to this 2 million ton of SAF pool. But interesting part there is how much of these capacities are going to produce SAF is a function of price. And my colleague will be, discussing that more in detail in the subsequent slide. Second aspect there is in the short term, definitely we see there will be a supply sufficient to meet the demand, but that's not sufficient when it comes to the long-term objective of airline industry, because in the long term we are not seeing diversification of technologies and ramp up of these capacities to produce SAF. And last and one of the most important point is when we look this supply pool from a geopolitics point of view, policy certainty point of view, we see that policy certainty and geopolitics are fundamental, geopolitics stability are fundamental drivers to have these projects come to the finish line. And feedstock is one of the important aspects of these projects. Feedstock prioritization is not happening despite the clear direction that the airline industry is looking at SAF as one of the most important levers to meet net zero 2050 objectives. So how the projects are located around the world. When you look this busy slide, this slide shows renewable fuel projects around the world, their number, and in terms of their capacity, which is total 55 million ton. There are a couple of interesting things which I would like to draw your attention on this slide. One is the stark difference in the bars. If you see Africa, for instance, it is one of the resource-abundant region. A lot of global biomass supply is in that region. But in terms of project realization, we see that's not happening because technology collaboration with this region is not happening. So basically, it's a clarion call to the governments to stand up and work to provide technology to this feedstock-abundant regions. When we look into the US, clearly, we see that policy is playing a very important role, and you can see from the size of the bar between 2025 and 2030, the renewable fuel capacities are going to increase significantly. Technology diversification is going to happen, which I will come later. When we look at the Europe, yes, again, a very similar growth. A lot of grants and innovation program which are there focused on the SAF technologies is helping these technologies to come up, these capacity to ramp up. North Asia predominantly is mostly contributed by China. And when we look into that region, we see that China can be a very important swing factor because China has a lot of HVO capacity in the country, and that capacity can be quickly converted into production of SAF. So that is a very important swing factor where again the policy direction will guide how much of SAF then can really come to the market. Asia Pacific, we see some of the leading players are already working there. But again, in terms of realization of these projects in that region, we see these projects are either delayed or very much slow in terms of their progress. Though we know that in terms of feedstock, this region is again very abundant. The point which is very important on this slide is in terms of technology diversification, which I mentioned in my previous slide also. When we see Europe, you will see a pink color bar on the top, which is basically power to liquid projects. And when we look into the US, it is red color, which is ethanol. So it clearly shows the regions which have feedstock available, they leverage on those feedstocks availability and try to build plant. But other thing I would like to highlight here is co-processing, the light, tiny green which you say. while we are building road to net zero through these technologies, it is important that as an industry, we are able to leverage, we are able to get benefit of low-hanging fruits like co-processing, where role of traditional oil energy companies is very important. Co-processing can happen in the existing refineries. We have already underlined that in some of our previous finance roadmaps. And what we see is the co-processing is not happening as it could have to meet the demand of SAF, at least in the near term. And it doesn't take much time in terms of investment also. This can turn very swiftly into the SAF production. So that will be missed opportunity again if that doesn't move forward. Coming to power to liquid, which is growing in Europe. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I looked at here. Sorry. So let's talk about power to liquid, which is looked as one of the most potential technology pathways when it comes to production of SAF. Even if we have biomass resources available, we will definitely need a technology which can take abundant CO2 available, whether it is biogenic or from the air, and convert that into the SAF. But let's spend a moment on the slide, When you look at the 1.7 million ton, that is the eSAF or power to liquid capacity that has been announced around the world. And in Europe, we know that there is a mandate. When we look into that mandate in Europe and other part of the world, around 0.7 million ton of SAF, PTL SAF will be required to meet the mandates. And when we track different projects, which are basically, by the way, 60 in numbers, we found that hardly 0.3 million ton of PTL SAF, basically this is a conservative approach, can be realized if all the conditions in terms of incentives to these plants, in terms of utility access, in terms of their completion schedule, stay on the track. So again, we may miss that, mandated volume if we don't see more incentives coming into this market. Another interesting fact on this slide is, among all the 60 projects, where basically 90% of projects are just announcements, only one project has been able to reach first investment decision, and which is moving forward in US, which is a Roadrunner project by Infinium. This is in public domain. And if we need to meet the target of 0.7 million ton, it means we have to build from now till 2030, 30 projects of same capacity so that we can meet the mandated volumes. And given each project take 4 to 5 year time frame, we really need to act now, otherwise it will be too late. So airlines are also doing their part, and to walk you through, I will hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Preeti. So far we've talked a lot about production, and if we look at what's happening in terms of airline commitments for offtakes, you can see that number is growing. And I know we previously presented an update in terms of how many airlines have committed to offtakes, and we're seeing a steady increase in that number. And here you can see a chart showing the logos of the airlines based on their first commitment. Of course, many airlines have undertaken several commitments. We're only showing the logo once, just for clarity here. But we've got over 170 agreements overall, covering 81 airlines. And this is really important in terms of boosting SAF and production and scale up. And of course, when we look at the overall concept of the offtakes, it is there to de-risk projects and to really get some movement in terms of the new technology pathways. That's important. But also airlines take a risk when they are entering into these agreements, especially when we're looking at first-of-a-kind projects. When we look at the broader landscape in terms of the energy providers and the traditional oil companies, they have the resources, they have the technical competence, they have the experience, they have the balance sheets to be able to support de-risking these projects. So they have to be more involved in this game. And I think that's really important. It can't be left to the airlines to try and support and de-risk all of these projects, to actually support the development of new technology pathways. So we need more players involved, we need more of the experienced oil companies to be involved to really step up and help support the development of a functioning market. And now when we look at, so we're trying everything we can to boost production, we're trying everything we can to boost SAF usage, but now we've got a bigger problem coming up when it comes to the mandates. So we have two mandates which have been enforced since the beginning of this year. in the UK, and we have the European mandate, the refuel mandate. And with both of those, there is a requirement for the suppliers to provide 2%, an average 2% of SAF on their overall jet fuel provision at airports, and that, of course, is a mandatory requirement. Most of the suppliers have chosen to actually pass on the so-called cost of compliance, and I say so-called, within the legislation in the form of a compliance fee. When we look at those compliance fees, what we see is that they tally up to over twice the market premium for SAF. So that's a big problem. So this chart really, I'm just going to spend a bit of time explaining this chart, because what you see with this chart is the blue line is the price for conventional fuel. The yellow line shows you what the market price is for SAF. So if an airline went to buy SAF by itself on the market, this is what it would hope to pay. The red line is what we see the end cost as a result of refuel. And you can see that stark difference. And the black line is even higher, and that's the UK cost. So this is a real problem. Actually, it's quite a travesty when you see, if you think about the difference between the yellow line and the two top lines, the black and the red, that money could be better used. In fact, airlines could basically upgrade their SAF, their fuel purchases to SAF, and that would actually avoid a further 3.5 million tonne of CO2 abatement. This is such a huge loss of opportunity, and it's a travesty in that case. So if we look at it in a different way, and if we look at it in terms of financials, the difference between that blue line, the cost of jet fuel as it is today, and the market price for SAF, when we look at the totality of the total volumes that will be required to be paid, so we're looking at 1 megaton, that equates to $1.2 billion, excuse me. The impact of the mandates means that the airlines are paying $1.7 billion on top of that. That is what could be used to buy more SAF, to get more production, to get more of a functioning market, to abate a further 3.5 million tonnes of CO2. So to actually solve that, we need three things. We need basically legislators to act and act now. Not spend years developing new legislation or corrective measures through legislation. They need to act because clearly this is an unintended consequence of the policy. So they need to make sure there's transparency in terms of how SAF and associated costs are added onto airline contracts. They need to provide certainty that airlines will get the documentation so that they can actually use the airlines can use the documentation of claims against ETS and Corsia. And airlines must have the option to enter into special SAF contracts with suppliers and also to be able to self-supply. There needs to be more flexibility. This has to be changed immediately. So these are some of the issues we're seeing, but we're also looking back, as Marie said, we're trying to solve some of the issues we see in terms of going forward. And one of the perennial questions we always have is in terms of feedstock availability. So I'm glad to say that we are conducting a study right now. We're doing with Worley. Worley is an engineering and professional services consultancy covering various energy sectors. And what we're asking and what we're working with them on is to really make sure that we step back and really look to understand how much feedstock will be available for SAF and whether it will be sufficient to meet our requirements as we go forward as well. So with this study, we're really going to project what's available on a per region basis, looking at feedstock, looking at technology rollout, looking at regulation finance, and build up a bottom-up picture in terms of feedstock availability. And in doing so, we are doing deep dives to look at domestic feedstock availability. We're looking at supply chains and infrastructure readiness, and all of the aspects to really give a practical assessment of how much SAF feedstock will be available. And when we look at the tallied up numbers which we're seeing right now, I'm giving you a preview of a very detailed study which will be launched in about 2 or 3 weeks. And when we look at the feedstock availability overall, the unconstrained feedstock availability, of course, you can see there in terms of the big numbers on the left-hand side. What we do then is to really understand the practical situations of how much of that feedstock can be cultivated and made available for bioenergy production. And that's what gives us the numbers we see in the middle bars. But then, importantly, and this is always a question which we're asked, how much of that is going to be used by other sectors? So our approach is really to actually assign that requirement based on the volumes we see as what the demand will be for those sectors, and then see what's available for SAF. And the good news, of course, is what we're seeing is that there should be sufficient feedstock available for SAF as we go forward. And that's a really important emerging conclusion, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of interest in the detailed report as it becomes available. But there are, of course, certain key countries which we would consider as feedstock hotspots for SAF. And they include the United States, Brazil, Europe, India, China, Indonesia. And there you can see in this map here in terms of the potential which is available. But it's not just those countries. There's opportunities in Africa, as you can see, and in the Middle East as well. So there's a lot of opportunity. Actually, in terms of the countries I mentioned, there's an opportunity to harness over 700 million tons of feedstock for SAF. So these are things we'll be working on as we go forward as well, to make sure that we, as an aviation industry, are able to source the right volumes of SAF going forward. But one of the issues I do want to raise, it's linked also with what legislators are thinking as a solution, which is mandates. Because clearly the focus needs to be on technology rollout. While we see sufficient feedstock is available, and that's a good result, the issue we do see is technology readiness. So when we want the other pathways to be mature, we need them to be scalable, we need them to be commercially available. That is where the governments really should be thinking about supporting the industry. And that would also help in terms of scale up. So that, that is the actual opportunity right now. That's where we want the focus of the governments itself. And of course that will lead to jobs, and that will lead to SAF. Let me hand over back to Preeti now, because I think we have a deep dive on India as well.
Yeah, when we are in India, how we can miss talking about India and how India fits in this bigger picture. I think we started with on different platforms, so I think at IATA we are trying to work with Indian stakeholders to bring them on the different platforms which we bring in. And when it comes to SAF production, the question which comes to us, which we try to find the answer, how India can write a winning story or can lead, in terms of production of SAF. So the answer lies in a very simple, 3 points. It's a very, it's a basic rule. When you work on your advantage or resources, you're going to win in that, game or in that competition. And India has a resource advantage. The graph which my colleague Hermant showed in terms of the hotspot, India is one of the hotspot. And even though the feedstock are being utilized for other applications, still 10% of global feedstock will be available for the production of SAF. And that's the feedstock which India can leverage. And the country also is one of the leading refiners. So you have feedstock, you have refining capability to start with using existing feedstock like lipids, using existing feedstock like ethanol, and then build the road towards Fischer-Tropsch and more complex technologies where we need some time to scale up these technologies. So that can be a very important and fundamental winning strategy. Second comes the role of policies. And in last 1 decade, we have seen, rise of India when it comes to ethanol success stories or G20 leadership. What we see that the continuation of similar success stories in terms of financial grants, which we understand is available in India in the form of PM Jeevan Yojana and other, tax rebates. I think that needs to be extended to the sustainable aviation fuel production. If we really need to see the increase in sustainable aviation fuel production in the country. And one of the most important part is we understand this is a country where a lot of, focus and emphasis on the agriculture sector. And SAF is not just about aviation story. It links very well and very, closely into the rural employment and economic opportunity, which is time that India should leverage and write a similar story the way we have seen into the ethanol blending program. So essentially we see it as make in India for the world, not just in the production of SAF, but also using the local engineering capability. And we are in the aviation conference, and India is third largest growing aviation market in terms of commercial transport and also growing for cargo as well, what we heard in the previous session. It's an opportunity for the country to emerge as a regional SAF hub, because I'm not going into the fine numbers, we can always share that with you. But even if we use the existing feedstock for road transport and we use the leftover feedstock or the scale up the other technologies which are based on the biomass, the country will have sufficient SAF production, not only just for its own use, but also to use it for the international carriers and use book and claim also, so that other airlines around the world can take benefit of that. So truly that can help India to write its own SAF success story. So I will stop there and hand over back to Nico.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions, just noting that we have a hard stop at 4:30. Yeah, I'll ask you to raise your hand, state your name and your question. So I'll start with the gentleman in the front. Yeah. Mics are coming, I think. No, you got front.
Ravi Nair from Media Leku. A couple of questions, hard questions. In either, how big a setback is Trump for global SAF ambitions? I mean, and not just Trump, we have lots of climate skeptics in power in the world. So we have seen even EU scale back its green ambitions in various domains. So is SAF not just a dream now?
Yeah, I think it's obviously a setback, but I don't think it's going to halt or reverse progress. I think it will just slow progress. Now that's bad enough, you could argue, and the 2050 deadline is obviously coming furiously fast. So it does imperil, success on the 2050 horizon. Any delay does, and that's clearly a problem. Another problem, which is related, is the fact that oil is so cheap. Yeah. So when the world has created new energy markets in the past, it's always been out of, necessity and acute self-interest. It hasn't really ever happened because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. And of course, I think that also diminishes the sense of urgency that people have if Brent is trading below $63 a barrel. It would need to trade, certainly about 80, maybe above $100 a barrel before people would really feel pressured into creating new energy markets. So that's a problem, and maybe I'll stop there.
Is it not time to put a real deadline, because 2050 looks unachievable even in best circumstances? The production is not there, the pricing is too high, use is not there.
Yeah, so is it unachievable?
Yeah.
Well, I think the message that we're clearly trying to convey here is that it is entirely achievable. Yeah, there's enough feedstock. We have enough technologies, to get started, and while we're using those, the other ones can mature and come to market. And actually, the money involved is very comparable to the money that was involved in creating the previous new energy markets, notably, obviously, wind and solar, which governments supported by the same kind of amounts of money each that we think that we need to support the sustainable aviation fuel market with. Yeah. So, of course, when you tot it up and look at it over the 2050, out until 2050, it's 4.7 trillion, and you go, oh my God, how's that ever going to happen? But that's where I'm saying, per year, it's what we already gave to wind, and it's also what we already gave to solar. So that makes it look a lot less intimidating. And I have to say that the world needs to really integrate the fact that the world is subsidizing large oil companies to the height of $1 trillion per year. Yeah? So with that money, if it were redirected in its totality, we could solve our energy transition in less than 5 years. Yeah. So that has to be repeated again and again, because the world stage is not repeating this. Last year, COP didn't say it. G20 didn't say it. They said it the year previous, but yesteryear, nobody said we need to phase out these harmful direct producer subsidies. That clearly has to be done. So if all of that were possible, then we would be ahead of time. Yeah. So the thing that's really missing is the courage and the willingness to take on vested interests.
But when you have the political powers with these vested interests, how do you foresee that happening? I mean, today Trump is not going to do anything against the energy companies.
No, but you know, I think a lot of other countries could obviously come to the fore, and that's what we were trying to show Preeti and Hermant in Preeti's and Hermant's slides. Yeah.
No, this question can go into a long discussion, but when we look into the recent big beautiful bill, there is 45V, 45Z, and 45E, which is basically for SAF, for offsets, and also for hydrogen. We see for hydrogen already those incentives which were being announced before there is a consideration to have the momentum on, and similarly for SAF production. So we can't say it has stopped. These are under consideration, and we may see, because US is a very important player, as you saw on the slide. And as Murray said, I think there is enough potential. On the slide, you can see even India has a potential to produce 40 million ton. And if you see its own jet demand today, it is close to 8 or 9 million ton. So there is the ability in the ecosystem.
And the other dynamic, of course, is energy security. So, states and regions are thinking more about energy security. And in that mix, we should see more of an increase in terms of renewable energy as well. And can we see, and one of the priorities for us is to make sure states understand the prospects for SAF within that mix. So the dynamics are not just one way, there's other dynamics as well, particularly in terms of what we've seen in terms of changes in policy following Ukraine and other developments as well.
Yep, Ellis Taylor from Syria. The presentation sort of really made a case that mandates have not been applied very well, that there are pricing issues that have come with it, and so I think having made the point that governments would be better to focus less on mandates and more on enabling the technology and scaling up. Having said that, there are a number of IATA members who are asking their governments to bring in mandates, so they're not at a competitive disadvantage. So in that reality, in that situation, what would you say are the major policy things that governments really need to understand if they're going to go down putting a SAF mandate in place?
Yeah, we look at this in our policy roadmap, and as an economist, and there's a lot of literature out there as to how do you best create new energy markets or new markets in general. And the consensus in the literature is that first you start with the technology push, right? And once you have a product, once you actually have a product and some quantity of it, then you can start mandating. And this was, I don't need to say, we told you so, but we did, yeah? And we totally said to the policymakers that putting in a mandate in an immature market with insufficient supply is going to drive up costs. And boom, here you go. So, if you insist on doing mandates, you must also, as a policy maker, put into place simultaneously protection against all these, foreseeable negative impacts of that policy. So there has to be a package and a combination. And the policy also needs to break out of aviation and transportation. Yeah, this is a global energy problem. It's not an industry problem. So as long as we keep persisting thinking about this as an industry problem, we're doomed to fail.
There, and the gentleman over there.
Good afternoon, panel. Thank you for these insights. I have two very good questions for Preeti. So firstly, can you please highlight a bit on when you were saying that feedstock prioritization is not happening? Because last year we have seen a couple of feedstock hotspots like China or Indonesia removing the export tax rebate, levying the domestic obligation and stuff like that. Secondly, when you are presenting the case for India's SAF, you highlighted quite a bit on the co-processing thing. And we have seen oil companies like Indian Oil doing it in Panipal, BPCL doing it in Baragarh for the integrated refinery with the same gas and all that stuff. So how do you think India can leverage the co-processing and integrating thing? Because we already have a very huge import mandate for the fossil fuels and stuff. So how does this reach with? Thank you.
That's a great question, I would say. I think first of all, about the feedstock prioritization, right? Let's take example of ethanol from different generations, 1G, 2G. Ethanol has a demand in the road transport, in chemicals, and also for aviation, for alcohol reject, we need ethanol. And what we see in different countries, including India, is the priority is use it, blend it in gasoline and use it. We understand there are existing, supply chains. But at the same time, the road transport has solution of compressed natural gas, CNG, or biogas. And road transport also has solutions like hydrogen, heavy duty transport has solution of LNG. But for airplanes, we don't have those solutions, right? For airplanes, we have SAF, and 65% of the net zero target is going to come from SAF. And it's also a hard to abate sector. So it's a feedstock rationalization which needs to come from the governments, not just in India, but around the world, We have US, we have Brazil as PD ethanol producer. Same is for lipids, where our lipids are important, whether they are important for biodiesel. I don't say we stop immediately, but we start prioritizing because it takes time, efforts, and money to make those shifts. So that's what I meant by the feedstock prioritization. And on second question on co-processing, I think you're right. Our understanding is also saying that in India, the producers are already looking to start co-processing, which we see is a very swift and very, agile solution in terms of that you can do it in the existing refineries at the 5% limit approved by ASTM. We understand there is a discussion going on, and already, under DEP's plan, it is approved that 30% of co-processing can be done. If it is approved at the ASTM level, it means refiners can co-process more of those lipid feedstock. Again, question is linked to your first question, the feedstock prioritization. And I would say, last but not the least, it's an opportunity for India and many other countries to make sure that used cooking oil collection supply chains are being created with a robust tracking mechanism, and it can be another, opportunity to use these domestic feedstocks.
Thank you. We'll take one last question from the gentleman here, then we have to give the floor to the next briefing. So please, sir.
Thank you. Chen Fanren from Aviation Week and Transport World. In April, the Chinese government has issued its first SAF export target, and also allowed the export of SAF under the same harmonized system HS codes as conventional jet fuel. I just want to hear your comments on this development. Although of course it will be towards the positive side, I'm just wondering there could be any impact or potential issues on the global SAF supply chain or certification frameworks. Thank you.
So first I would say on the certification part, I think we understand certification part is from the both point of view. One is ASTM certification, because we understand China is also developing M2J pathway, and that pathway is still under ASTM certificate, ASTM approval. So that is ASTM qualification part of it. Second is from the certification point of view. We understand the certification of feedstock supply chain is very important. When China is looking into that export market, there is a inherent or intrinsic requirement that the certification criteria of these feedstock supply chain and the carbon intensity benefits are very well reflected. And that's where I think at IATA we have this, different platforms which allow those kind of transparencies and that kind of mechanism.
And just to add, of course, we want global markets for the supply of SAF, and so that's, as long as sustainability criteria are met, and we have the right certification modules, then basically we want global markets, so airlines will be able to access and their energy sources, as they do with jet, on a global market.
I think that we also look forward to more production in China, and if we get more production out of China, then maybe other countries will be stimulated to follow.